Welcome back, colleagues and fellow STEM education advocates. This video will offer a variation of my Scratch video, outlining the same type of project where students apply knowledge of rudimentary math concepts to create a game of Pong, but with microbits. We will be using the block-based coding platform that the Microbits website offers to create this game of Pong, specifically by writing code for placing the sprites, which will consist of the paddle and the ball, manipulating the movement of the ball, inputs to control the paddle and make it move, and other game dynamics regarding the movement of the ball when coming into contact with the paddle, and the score. So, let's get right into it. When you go to makecode.microbit.org, you will see this page. You'll go to New Project, name it, and then you will see an interface that looks like this, with a menu of sorts in the center denoting different types of blocks of code that can be used for different purposes. On the top left is a simulation of the actual microbit, and the space on the right is where our code will appear. We're going to need to create some sprites, which are variables that we can manipulate. So let's go to variables and create two of them, naming them ball and paddle respectively. And blocks of code will appear that will allow us to set our variables on the microbit interface. We may just have to pick the name of the appropriate sprite here in the dropdown for this block. And since we want the sprites to appear immediately, we are going to snap it into the onStart block, which should be there by default. And because we want the ball and paddle to register as a sprite in the Pong game that will appear on a specified point on the coordinate plane that are the 5x5 LED lights on the microbit, we are going to go to the Game option in the menu and select the Create Sprite At with spaces for coordinates block. And you'll notice that by default it will appear at 2, right at the center of the interface, and if you read the first LED light on the top left corner as being 0, you'll be able to figure out how to plot the sprite where you want. Notice how there aren't going to be 4 quadrants, so none of the coordinates will be denoted with negative numbers. We will do the exact same thing for the paddle, but we'll set the Y coordinate to 4 since we want the paddle to be on the bottom of the microbit interface. And from the Game option in this menu, there's also a block to create a scoring system, so we'll drag that in and set the score to 0. Now there will be certain things we want to happen continuously, and one of those things is the movement of the ball. So we'll go to the Game option and drag the block that says Move Sprite into the Forever block, which should also be there by default. But if it isn't, you can access that from the basic operators in the menu. We want the ball to continuously move by 1, but notice what happens when the ball gets to the edge of the LED display. This is because we have not told the ball what to do when it comes into contact with the edge, and there's a block for that in the Game menu as well. But first, since there is a condition that has to be met for a certain event to occur, we are going to need to access the If-Then blocks from the Logic menu. Once we drag that in, we can go back to the game operators and find the block for the condition that has to be true to result in a specified event, and that will be the IsSpriteTouchingEdge block. Just make sure the correct sprite is selected from the dropdown. And then from the game menu, we will select the block that contains the event that we want to occur. We want the block to turn, not a specified number of degrees, but we want the ball to turn around a range of degrees at random, so the movement of the ball will be unpredictable. And since we are expressing what we want the ball to do in mathematical terms, we will select a block from the math operators. And since we want the program to turn the ball a random number of degrees in the other direction, we'll select this block here and then indicate a range that will make the movement of the ball as erratic as possible. And now we will want to write code that will dictate the movement of the paddle, which will not be moving on its own. Rather, we will be controlling it with the various input, so we will have to go to these operators and select the On button press block. And since we want one of the game sprites to move when we press A, we are going to go back to Game and select Sprite Move By, and select the appropriate sprite from the dropdown. And what you'll notice is that the sprite that is the paddle will be moving toward the right. And since the A button is on the left side of the microbit, it would make sense for the paddle to move left when prompted by this input, and this is where students will apply knowledge of negative integers, as reflected by this learning standard that posits students should understand negative and positive integers and what they denote relative to a given starting point. So if we change this to a -1, we'll see that the paddle now moves toward the left upon pressing button A. And B, dragging the same block from the input into our script and selecting B from the drop-down, and indicates that we want the paddle to move to the right with a +1. And now we're going to have to create the code that will determine what the ball does when it comes into contact with the paddle. And this will be a continuous thing, so we will once more select the forever block from the basic operators, and essentially do the same thing we did to dictate the ball's movement when touching the edge, dragging an if-then block from the logic menu, except the condition involves another variable, so rather than selecting is touching edge, we will select this block that will allow us to drop the variable of the paddle in from the variables menu. And we'll drag the same blocks from the game and math operators to get the ball to turn the other direction randomly when the ball comes into contact with the paddle. And if you'll remember, we have a score element for our game, and we're going to want that to change every time the player successfully hits the ball with the paddle, so there will have to be another event that occurs when the condition of the ball touching the paddle is met. So we'll nest another if-then block here, repeating the process above for the condition, but for the event, we'll drag in the change score by block, and we'll leave the integer at 1. And before we move on to the last part, you may notice on the microbit simulator on the top left that the ball is moving rather quickly. And we can remedy that by making the ball pause in between movements by selecting and dragging the pause block from the basic operators and placing it after the block of code that dictates the ball move by 1 LED light. And we can leave that at 100. You'll see that the ball moves at a more reasonable speed. Now we can return to finalizing the last bit of code, as we want something to happen when the player scores a certain number of points. And since there is another event that should play out if another condition is met, we will be nesting another if-then statement from the logic operators. And since the condition involves one variable, the score, being equal to something, we are going to select this block from the logic operators under the comparison section, and under the game operators, drag the score block here. And we can set the score to 25. Even though we tell the game to change the score by 1, the code seems to be registering every score increase by units of 5. So this way, when the ball hits the paddle 5 times, we can make a phrase appear by dragging the show string block under the basic operators and snapping it to the second part of the if-then block. And then we can type whatever message we want to appear, and after the player successfully hits the ball with the paddle 5 times, we see our message scrolling. Now we are ready to download our script, and with our microbit connected to our computer via USB port, we can download our code into the microbit and play the game there.